Welcome, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me Brad. How are you, Brad?
Good. Yourself?
I'm doing quite well today. Yeah, well, now that I'm up and about, I had a rough night. Got up at like 2:30 in the morning after sleeping in intervals of like an hour, checking the clock each time. It was miserable.
Oh,
But
geez.
here
That
we,
yeah happens to be now and then.
yeah. But here we are, and today we're going to have the first discussion in a series of discussions. I'm going to invite different authors on. You're the first to talk about writing, particularly to talk about, let's say, or question is a better way to phrase it. Some assumptions that we make about writing. And today's podcast is titled, Furthermore, Genre Must Be Destroyed. And I actually kind of hate genre as a concept. I think that it doesn't actually refer to anything. I think that it gets in the way when it comes to both writing and reading. But we'll see if that bears out. What do you think about the idea of literary genres? Do you ever give it really much thought?
I can't say in depth except for when prompted the other day. Although as soon as you said genre needs to be destroyed, I was very interested to hear what you think about that because my understanding of genre really is just a way of categorizing stories along expected tropes, types of characters, settings, themes, etc. Basically, to give the audience a sort of expectation of what they can look forward to going in, or to set a baseline anyway.
Yeah, well, your impression is very much in line with a lot of common definitions. I'd kind of like to jump into those just so that we have them. Before I do, always forget to do this. I'm going to shill for a second. I hope you don't mind. So, for you listeners out
I'll go
there,
for it. Your
uh,
podcast.
yeah. For you listeners out there, I wanted to let you know that I have revamped my editing service. I've rebranded. We're now the Wild Isle Style Guide. So I've niched myself in, particularly focusing on literary style when it comes to writing fiction. So if you're an author out there and you want to up your stylistic game, if you want to enhance the voice of your narrators and your characters, if you want to, let's say, reach back into the annals of history and resurrect prose of an older time for the modern day, then come check out wildislelit.com under my editing section and give me a query and see if we can work together. If you're really into it and you want to go full in, I also have a combo style guide and thematic analysis so I can help you embed theme deep into your story. So this is going beyond just the ups and downs, twists and turns of plot into symbolism and making your story mean something, making it argue for something deep. That's the difference between a deep and a shallow story. So that's wildislelit.com slash editing, I think is actually how you get there. But get on my webpage, check it out. I also have a book out, and I'll be having more stuff out soon. Be on the lookout for that. But what I have out now is Wand Smoke Broken. It is a weird fantasy story that kind of reads somewhat like a western. I think Brad, you're pretty far into it. What do you think so far of Wand Smoke Broken?
I quite like it. What I refer to it as is fantasy with an American twist, because with what you describe as the town of South being akin to an old Virginia coal mining town, and you have a sheriff, and they're wielding guns and whatnot, and a bit of steampunk technology thrown in there. Um, I quite like it. I'd recommend it to anybody listening.
Thank you very much, Brad. I really appreciate it. All right, I think I'm done shilling, except for this podcast. So before we jump back into genre, I will say if you would like to appear on the podcast and discuss one of the topics that has yet to be discussed, please go ahead and give me a contact. You can contact me through my website or any social media. Just get a hold of me. If I know roughly who you are, then I might very well invite you on. The topics of discussion Now, if you have something that you want to discuss, you want to recommend it to me, go ahead and put that in the contact form. But what we have planned are that are still open are our novels, no, are sorry, our novel, talking about originality, inspiration, homage, and derivation, delving into the depths theme as thesis. The author spake upon the face of the waters. It's talking about setting and world building. Human after all, so it's a discussion about characters, narrative voice, let's say potence or pretense, so discussing what narrative style and narrative voice even are, regression to the mean, rules of writing, bell curves, and Pareto distribution, so talking about how one uses the rules of writing, art versus escapism, that's narratives as nourishment or decadence. That's something that I'm particularly excited to talk about, as terribly judgmental as I am. Spirit channeling, so that's storytelling via various mediums, because as I think in the modern day we conflate storytelling across literature, across television, movies, games, etc. And I don't think they're exactly the same. And I've got one that's probably reserved for the captain. If you know who captain is, then you know who he is. It's when is the weeb always wrong? And it's discussing narrative devices, present and absent, specifically within anime and manga, which harm a new author's stories. And as a weeb of old, I will admit that, yeah, if you haven't had a strong literary background, that can hurt you. All right, so I think that's finally the end of all the shilling. Let's get into genre and specifically definitions. Now, Brad, you had brought up that you felt like genre was categorizing, let's say, essentially common conventions, uh, and that's
Hmm.
actually, yeah, that's actually pretty accurate. It's kind of what we get. Um, Now, there's a little bit of history to it. So, if I just look up some definitions, we see genus, kind, sort, or style. Uh, so that fits in with what you talked about there. I guess Aristotle, I didn't know this before I started taking some notes, had an idea of genre as being like a species based particularly on the telos or the purpose. And this is with rhetoric, so oration, but I could see that crossing right over into literature as well, suggesting that the genre should be based on what it does, like what the function of it is. And I think that's how we get something like the higher level literary genres, and that's like fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And that seems to make sense. So that's not those aren't the lines that he obviously drew on it. I believe Northrop Frye, as a guy, he came in and I think he, amongst other things, made those lines amongst a bunch of other ones. But I don't really think it is quite worthwhile delving too deeply into that. I think we should stick with, let's say, just really what I took off of Wikipedia. So I'll just read this out very briefly. So this has got categories that distinguish literature based on some set of stylistic criteria, sharing literary conventions. They typically consist of similarities in theme or topic, style, tropes, and storytelling devices, common setting and character types and/or formulaic patterns of character interactions and events, and an overall predictive form. And that's essentially a more fleshed out definition that you gave. But I've parsed out some concepts in there that I think we need to further define in order to really understand how we are categorizing different types of fiction, right? So we're kind of on board. Okay, genre is a category. I don't see how we could dispute that. But it seems to be a category that is based on tropes, based on conventions, and based on expectations. So we'll start out with tropes because, well, I won't reveal how I feel about tropes. You might already know. What's your familiarity with literary tropes?
Basically, common elements that pop up in certain stories might appear based on what the story calls for. In fantasy, for example, you've got some common tropes of the wise old man, the chosen one, the dark lord, things like that, which, not sure where to go from there.
Yeah, so well, that's a good one to
Probably
start with.
implied your.
It's
Sorry,
a
go
good
ahead.
one to start with. When you talked about, like, let's say, the wise old man or the Dark Lord, things like that. the question that then comes up is what makes those things tropes specifically?
Their common use,
Ah, okay, there we go.
or their what's the word I'm looking for here? How universally they can be applied within such a breadth of stories in that genre.
There's something interesting about that. The two answers that you gave, they can be, let's say, synonyms, but they can also not be synonyms. And what I mean by that is if something is
The
universal,
words again?
it is in common. But if it is in common, it is not necessarily universal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, so what I mean to say is like, let's say you might have a trope in English literature that is in common, right? But that doesn't exist outside of English literature due to some parochial nature of the English, and maybe it doesn't appear in French and literature. And in French literature, you might have different common things, but then across all of those different forms of literature, you may very well have universal, uh, let's say, universal types, right? We might call those archetypes. Uh,
Mm.
in fact, that is what an archetype is. So
Yeah, that's
it would
probably a
be
more
cat.
accurate term. Right?
Yeah,
That's probably a more accurate term to describe the wise old man rather than a trope. That's more of an archetype.
yeah. So now we have this bifurcation, which is where I think the we're going to get into the deeper discussion here. So now we have archetypes. Now, would we say that um, is one a subcategory of the other? Are archetypes a subcategory of trope, or is trope a subcategory of archetype? How would we think about it?
Hmm. I would. My guess would be trope would be a subcategory of archetypes because archetypes suggest something broader that can apply across more genres. Like we just said, the probably archetype is a better description of the wise old man because that can technically appear in any story you want. Whereas Dark Lord, generally, that's only going to pop up in fantasy. Generally speaking.
Okay, so we've got a system where we've got the big universals, those are the archetypes on top, and then we would say go down a level of let's say universality into the the more let's say things limited by time and by place. Then the question, this is going to be kind of a weird turn here, but I tend to turn into this kind of philosophical question. So with the the difference between a I'll use the word parochial to refer to like the limited trope, and then the arc. I guess I could just use the word trope. So we have a trope. Is a trope outside of its context? It might be a weird question. Like if I have a trope in England and I took it over to France, they would say there's no communication, so they don't know about, no one would know about one from the other. And I presented the trope from England to the French. Would that be a trope to the French?
Probably not, because to them it would be unconventional. It'd be something they're not
Yeah,
familiar with and doesn't have the background to it like it would in England.
yeah, okay. But the archetype would, because by definition it would apply across
Like
culture.
to tie that to an example really quick, the Lord of the Rings when it first came out was really took off in the United States because they didn't have that same background of folklore like the English did. The English had Robin Hood and the tales of King Arthur and all that, but in the United States they really didn't have that.
Yeah, so they were hungry for it right away because there was like a
Mm-hmm. It was
there was a hole, an absence.
Yeah, and it was new and interesting to them, and they didn't have the cultural backdrop that would have made it more familiar,
Yeah.
or at least, or
Um,
they did, used to, and they would have sort of moved away from it as after they declared independence.
yeah, and what that suggests to me is that there is for the universals, there is something in the universe uh counting us, we humans, we are part of the universe. So there's something in us as part of the universe that was receptive to that particular or elements in that particular narrative, right? So the archetypes will speak to human beings if they don't, or especially specifically if they don't already have them, because they have it's similar to how infants learn language. They have parts of their, or not really infants, but like toddler, like late toddlers, babies learn language, is that they have parts of their brain already ready to perceive the language, but then they have to look for language like things in the environment, and then their brains adapt to that. Perhaps archetypes are the same. Perhaps they are speaking to something that is, let's say, already built into our biology in some way.
Very Joseph Campbell argument there.
Yeah, oh, I have here with a thousand faces behind me. It's
I
also
have
a
it.
union
Yeah, I have it
argument.
myself. I have it myself. I still have to read it all the way through.
It's it's actually a dense read because Campbell assumes that you know about other, particularly psychoanalysts and other people who have investigated mythology, and you kind of miss some of what he's saying without it.
Hmm.
It took me a long time after I read the book to fully understand it. But I wanted to touch on that universality, the idea that Joseph Campbell's idea essentially that there is something universal with the archetypes, to then draw a contrast to the concept of tropes, so that we could really start to pick apart genre. So when we talk about tropes, and it's a, I don't want to say merely local, but it's particularly local, and it doesn't cross translate. Does that not suggest that the idea of trope does not touch down onto anything essential about, let's say, the universe or mankind, but only something contingent on a particular time in a particular place?
Yeah, it would suggest that it's a convention of that particular time or place, although those barriers can be broken down as you know, as stories cross borders more and more often, as people become familiar with the types of stories told in another country.
Yeah, so you could have cross pollination, but that
Yeah,
that
that's what I mean.
convention. Yeah, that convention though is it's a contingency, and I want to and the reason why I call attention to that is there's a difference between that which is contingent and that which is fundamentally categorical. And something that is categorical, that's like you know that is a reference to something that we are trying to encapsulate with language to the best that we can, so that we include everything that is essential to it and exclude as much that is not essential to it. Because to the degree that we include too much, we make errors, and the degree to which we exclude too much, we also make errors in our, let's say, communication about that idea. Um, if I were to concretize that idea, it'd be if I think the net is bigger than it is, and I'm playing, let's say, soccer, and I kick the ball, and I missed the goal because I kicked it into a place where I thought the net was. That's not good. But if I think the net is narrower, then I won't take opportunities to kick it into where I could have, because my if my perception of it is that it's narrower, then I'm not going to see all the range of actual full possibilities I have to score a goal. And I think the same thing is true for genre. And that kind of drives us toward expectations, right? Because yeah, this is going to be a weird aside, but I think it'll make sense. If I were to say, if a thing is a trope to the Englishman and is not a trope to the Frenchman, the question is it a trope or is it not a trope?
It depends on the setting.
Correct. And then I could ask a further question. If something is a trope in France, but someone is not very literate and they're not familiar with that trope, so it's not common, or it's not understood to be a trope, is it a trope to the Frenchman who doesn't understand it as such?
Mm.
Yeah, right. It's all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's not very clear. Here's another question. Before it was used commonly, was it a trope? Like the first time someone implemented something, was it a trope then?
I mean, not. It would have become a trope over time as its use became more and more common.
Yeah, and so you could see how because of all these contingencies, I think the word trope has no essence. I think fundamentally it is a statement about a particular state of circumstances. But when we say X is a trope, I think X isn't real. So, unlike the archetypes, which I do think are real, because I think there's a biological essence to them. There's something about, let's say, the human condition that can receive them. That may or may not bear out to the. What do you think of that idea? Before I don't want to just bulldoze on. So I've got to pose that as my thesis. I'll say it one more time just for clarity. I think that tropes as a literary concept are actually essentially just poor literary analysis. It's a invalid category because it's merely a statement about a contingent state of affairs that isn't referring to anything uh, in the real world. Whereas, as opposed to archetypes that do have some basis in what seems to be universal.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that tropes, because they're so dependent on context and the person applying them, and where they're being read and how they change over time. I'm thinking what you're getting at is just trope is just too nebulous a concept. It doesn't really have any solid foundation to it to be of any use.
Correct. And then if that's true, right, this is a little bit of like Chinese logic. If we accept this, then what about that? So then we want to get to expectations in regard to genre, because I think that you're familiar with the term genre expectations, like those two words juxtaposed together. Yes.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think that genre expectations themselves are the product of the same type of bad literary analysis as tropes. And honestly, here's why, right? So, uh, let's say you have a particular expectation of from a story, right? Like, let's say, I don't know if you're a fan of Conan the Barbarian and you read some of Robert E. Howard's later. Did you say that you are?
I am.
Awesome. Okay. Uh, I don't know if you read this particular story because this was, I believe, published posthumously because it was a draft at the time, a pretty good draft. I'm kind of sad that it never got published. Um, I can't remember the character's name, but it's essentially not a story that's not about Conan in which Conan appears, and um, it breaks all expectations. So I expected the hero in the Conan story to be Conan. I expected, let's say, the big bad at the end that's literally an ancient god to be defeated heroically in some way. Instead, what ended up happening is this god was killed by the unlikely hero just hurling a bench at it and that actually working and him being shocked as I was that that worked and then him just like taking the girl and running off. Um, and then the story ending with him telling Conan like I know you got this next adventure, but I think I'm just gonna not be a mercenary anymore and take this woman I just rescued and go get married. See ya. Uh, like it broke. Yeah, I mean it broke every expectation I had. Now that being said, would that make it any less of a swords and sorcery fantasy story of the Pulp Fiction era?
I wouldn't think so,
No, right?
because
And so all
the common elements are still there. Some of the audience's expectations are being met, as opposed as in terms of what they expect to appear. But then you might, just like rearrange things and do something different with them.
yeah, and so what that kind of shows is actually it's the fact of subversion being something that people sometimes delight in, depending on what gets subverted, um, suggests that expectations are actually not important. And this is something I learned through listening to a lot of Dr. Peterson. He talks about how a lot of psychologists would use the word expectations, and that was wrong because what they should have said is desire, right? Because there's a difference. When you expect something, it's something that you predict, but that doesn't say anything about how you are going to feel about it, right? Like, if I read a story and it, let's say, does things I don't expect, but I delight in it, I don't suddenly start lambasting it as being like bad or I might say it's uncharacteristic based on all the other, let's say, stories that are marketed a certain way. And that word market is going to come back in a little bit. But what I'm getting at here, rather roundaboutly, is that actually, I think that genre expectations are quite irrelevant, and it's whether or not you got what you desired. A good example of this might be A Song of Ice and Fire, which lots and lots of people love. If you don't know, if you just watched the television show, that's a Game of Thrones. But some people, I know a
Tried, I
particular.
couldn't get into it.
Say that again.
I tried, I couldn't get into it.
Yeah, some people don't like it, and I think
Show
the
that is, I've
reason.
not cracked the books open.
Oh, okay. Well, you might look the books a little bit more. Maybe if you didn't like the first two seasons of the show, then that But if you came in late, then the books are quite a lot better. But it is, let's say, how have we put this? So if you if you like me are used to fantasy doing certain things, it does something different, but you still like those things that it does. So the thought process isn't, oh, this isn't a fantasy story because it still has all the elements that would make it fantasy in setting, right? But its story structure, its plot structure, and its characters and characterization are different than other stories set in a fantastical setting. And if you happen to like that, if it fits your desires, then you like it and it's good. And then if you don't, you don't. But you notice here that,
Yes, I've seen a vociferous argument on that very subject.
yeah, right. So all of a sudden, expectations, though, you notice how those aren't actually relevant to the question of either whether that particular, Song of Ice and Fire, whether that's fantasy or not, right? Because all of a sudden, it's like I expected it being a fantasy story to have these other traits, and then the word other has now come up. So now it comes down to one, let's say, if one likes a particular set of conventions used, and we'll call those tropes, and desires them to be there, then he or she desires them to be there and wants them to be there and to be marketed to, and therefore comes to it goes expect and desires them there when the market label says something. But the question is that market label of any relevance to the essence of what makes that story of a kind? Because remember, now we can kind of get all, I know that was a really roundabout route, but now we're back to genre, right? Because the question is, what makes it of what makes a genre of the kind that it is, right? Like, can we use tropes for that? As because the tropes are like hyper ethereal and they're transient and depend on time and place. Can we use expectations for that? Like, or even desires for that matter? Are we going to say like a genre is only what a particular set of audience desire it to be? Or conventions of the time? Do you see kind of what I'm getting at? The subjectivity that is rife in the modern and conventional ways that we define genre.
As I do see that.
Yeah. So what I think. So that's my issue. So I guess I'll throw a more articulated question at you to see. So that is the fundamental bedrock I have for justifying the destruction of genre as a concept. I don't think that it refers to um, anything essential. I think that it refers to a number of subjective elements that are going to be transit based on time and place and individual. And I think that's also why you have to have an infinite number of subcategories that no one can agree on. And do you think that's proper justification for attacking the at least the conventional use of the word genre?
I can see where you're coming from with that because an example to illustrate that would be the presence of subgenre, where you've got fantasy, and then within that there's medieval fantasy, there's urban fantasy, there's Nordic fantasy, like the story I'm working on, and that branches off in other mediums as well, like music. You've got rock, then you've got a subcategory of heavy metal, then you've got the subcategory of black metal, then you've got a subcategory of like 15 or 20 different styles of black metal, and just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, this is something I did a number of lectures called the philosophy of language, and this was something that I pointed out as having a bad definition. The more that you have to add qualifiers to a concept or definition or term, it suggests that the term is bad because it means that it's either not doing its job or it does or it covers too broad a spectrum and then it has to be narrowed as to be useful, right? Because if you've got like I don't know 1,000 subgenres of rock, right? It's like you can't just say, well, I like rock music because that doesn't mean anything, right? Because the range
Mm-hmm.
is so big that it's like,
Be
well,
the
you
cool of
have to
calling
ask,
Nickelback.
yeah, right. It's not useful. And the same thing you could say with fantasy, right? Um, so before jumping back down that rabbit hole, I think what it's a what would be useful is for us to talk specifically about what we think what are commonly referred to genres are. And then I think by just parsing out what it is that we're actually referring to when we talk about our modern conceptions of genre, we might be able to actually figure out a better method of categorization. That's going to be a much heftier bit of the conversation. But let's start off with fantasy, since both of us are fantasy writers and we hang around a lot of fantasy authors. Um, what the hell is the genre of fantasy?
That's a very good question. At its core, I see it as carrying on the tradition of old mythology and folklore. That's the purpose of it that I see anyway.
Okay, old mythology and folklore. Now, the
Dealing
Socrates, the
with
evil
the gods and
Socrates.
monsters and the nature of the world and the nature of the divine, things like that.
So the Socrates in me wants to ask,
Very broad, and a lot of people can turn on a lot of people. A lot of those elements can appear in other stories as well. That's just the baseline I'm trying to start from.
yeah. So I want to ask if you have a story that is set, let's say, in an in a let's say contemporary technology, but entirely fictitious universe. Another way to say that is an entirely fantastical universe. If I want to be old about it, if you go back more than 100 years, that's how they talk about it. Is that a fantasy story? So the entire universe is fantastical, but it's very similar to what our modern day to day life is.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Because
that
by that,
fantasy?
yeah, by that, going on that framework, you could argue that um, any story set in the modern world, but say in a fictional town, you could say that's fantasy. Because I'm aware that is the problem with the word fantasy itself. Because technically, it means anything you can conjure with your imagination. Like we typically think of swords and sorcery when we hear fantasy. But I've also heard it said that sci-fi is technically a subgenre of fantasy. So it's really think about the meaning of the term. It's much broader than we usually conceptualize.
Yeah, and what that makes me think is that actually fantasy is a way to describe um, my argument would be that fantasy is actually a description of setting, and it's not a just it's not there is no kind of you could if you wanted to like classify stories that are fantastical, but I think that that would be such a broad camp of stories, so it wouldn't be useful as a concept.
Hmm.
Uh, that's my argument. I don't think fantasy is if we're gonna have the word genre as a species of fiction, I don't think fantasy is a single species by itself. It's just there's two.
No, certainly not.
Yeah. Um, and you mentioned science fiction, right? So we can talk about what makes science fiction what it is.
Usually speculative in a way, imagining how things are going to look in the future or how things would look with a higher level of technology than we're currently at. Essentially, look to the. I remember it was a question that Adernus did on Minds a while back, where he asked about the distinction between fantasy and sci-fi, and my answer was fantasy. I think is about looking to the past, to old traditions and folklore and mythology, and exploring what they say about the human condition. And sci-fi is about looking to the future, speculating what the world may look like if we stay our current course, if we go on an entirely new one.
That brings up questions like I think of, let's say, Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. And here's a kind of question. So imagine that you discover that the human race was invented by a technologically advanced race of elder things that basically engineered human beings out of apes present on Earth. Is that fantasy? Is that science fantasy, or is that science fiction?
Probably straddle the line between all three of those, depending on how you handle them. Like if the in Assassin's Creed, they have the ones who came before, or I guess they're sort of demigods or something like that. In Halo, they have the Forerunners. Yeah, that's a pretty broad concept that again can pretty much cover any of those genres, depending on how exactly it works into the story.
Yeah, so that makes it again. I'm not quite sure where I would put that. I would, if I had to pin it down, I would say the line between well, I know that the line between fantasy and science fiction used to not exist, like in the pulp era. It just isn't. It's just not there. Um, the moment where Conan runs into the elephant who came from a different planet, like, and also has a ruby that has sorceress powers. It's like okay, like here's here's where this line didn't exist back then. Um, and so I would say that science fiction is perhaps a type of fantasy, but what makes it distinct, if there is something that makes it distinct, and we do feel that there is that there's something very, very hard and grounded in plausible reality, like our plausible reality, that makes science fiction as opposed to fantasy fiction. Do you think that's a fair analysis?
I think so, because to apply that, to apply an example on that, you think about the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek, where Star Wars pretty much is space fantasy because you have the flying ships and interstellar travel and all that, but you've also got space magic and the Force. Whereas Star Trek, like I'm not super experienced with it, but my understanding is it's much more grounded, and it's not necessarily in hard science. Again, it's going to be speculative as opposed with what is possible in the future, but there's still at least the sense that they're aiming at something more realistic.
Yeah, so that's essentially the difference between hypothesized scientific progress versus magic, right? Uh, I think that's a probably pretty good line. But then that would put science fiction in the same realm of setting, fundamentally, that we just put uh, fantasy in, right? Like here is the universe. Does this universe have magic in it? Well, like overt magic, that seems to be fantasy, fantastical. And does it have let's say, advanced technology that we don't have? that kind of suggests that what we're dealing with is science fiction insofar as it's been, let's say, made hard enough or crunchy. They even use the word crunchy, right? I talk about tech and science fiction. So let's look at some other ostensible genres like horror, right? Horror as a genre. What would really make something within the horror genre?
I'm not super familiar with horror, but my sense is it's supposed to play on the human instinct of fear, explore ways to induce that in the reader, what it really means, what's the nature of it, what can it make us capable of, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Uh, Now, there's all kind of, I could be picky if I wanted to about like, well, how much fear does it have to put in you for it to count as horror? But instead of doing that, my brain immediately went back to Aristotle, and I noticed that horror is not the same way of categorizing that fantasy and science fiction were, whereas those were very close to the setting. You could have any possible setting with horror, right? Like it's as long as it does
Hmm.
something particular to the reader.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm getting at there is that horror seems to be much more, if we're going to define it, of it as a species based on the telos or the function of the fiction itself. Fiction made to instill fear in the reader might classify it as horror.
I say so, yes. I don't think I have a argument against that.
Yeah. So, well, then the question, a
Well,
couple
but that
questions come
that
up.
brings the question: are we even? Hmm, not sure where to go
Go
from
ahead.
that.
Well, the question that came to my head was, okay, so can a different literary element eat up what, let's say, we might have found here in genre, right? Because it's like, okay, the idea that Aristotle's idea of genre was speciation based on telos, we have something that seems to fit. Does some other literary element take that away from genre? Because it could very well be like, is horror an element of plot? Immediately my head says no, because I could think of a bajillion different plot structures that could utilize horror as a component. So um, plot doesn't seem to be there. Character, no, I could do whatever characters and instill horror. Setting, my immediately thought is no, because I could take any setting and add elements of horror to it. Um, what's left? Theme, no. Symbolism, no. Yeah, horror seems to be firmly within the telos, the purpose, the function, what the work does. So we might actually have a case for genre, and it could have been that Aristotle was right a couple thousand years ago. Um, but we'll see, because I've got a couple other genres that are similar to horror, well, such as like mystery, right? Because we all kind of know what a mystery story is. Am I overstating that?
I don't think so. It's pretty commonly understood. There's a question to be answered.
Yeah.
Put it
Now,
to put it rather
go ahead.
simply.
I'll put it rather simply. Now I could ask the question: is mystery not more so an element of plot? What I mean by that, because what makes my head just came up different than horror. So with horror does not drive the plot forward. Horror is the experience instilled in the reader. Mystery, in the case of a mystery story, is what drives the plot forward. Right? It's the tension is tied up in the answering of a central question, and the question almost functions as the antagonist in a sense. Not really, because there is an antagonist, but that's beside the point. The point is that the resolution, the climax of the story hinges on that. So in my head, I'm thinking maybe mystery isn't really. It's not a purpose. It's not a function. It's an element of plot. Do you think does that stand to reason?
Um, I would think so, because okay, what exactly do you mean when you say function? Because like we said, horror is the function of that is to instill fear in the reader. Like um, usually that's the purpose of it, and then, to explore the nature of fear if that's what you're going for in the story. And mystery, maybe that's the function there is meant to be tension. Maybe it's meant to be wonder. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure where to go with that.
Well, that's a right line of thought, right? Because the question is, okay, is not the telos is not the function of mystery to, let's say, provide an element of inquisitiveness and questioning, and to make the
Hmm.
reader into a detective. And there's a pretty strong argument there.
To
The
keep them
question that
interested enough that they want to follow where it's going throughout the plot. You keep the twists and turns interesting and all that.
yeah. So here's the conflict, right? So there's a question, does it belong to genre or does it belong to plot? Now, the answer to that question, I would think, would come in to how universal does this stretch across stories, right? So in a sense, all stories, I would say, are driven by unanswered questions in the plot, but then also all stories in some sense make the reader into a kind of um, detective, right? Now, some more than others, but in a sense, if you've got a plot, you have unanswered questions in the plot. Will he X or will he not X, right? And insofar as the reader's engaging with it, the reader is the person wondering about that question. Um, so what I guess that's the question then that is posed to us. Um, what what is mystery more? Is mystery Does mystery belong more so to plot or does it belong more so to its function on the reader? That's a very difficult question to answer, by the way. I apologize for asking it.
No, that's fine. I would say it depends on how forefront the mystery is, because usually, like you make the point that a lot of stories have some kind of mystery in them, like what's going on here, how is this going to resolve. You can have more subtle mysteries buried in certain stories. It's mystery when it's used as a genre category usually means like the mystery, the big one is the forefront of the plot. Whereas like I said, in other stories it can be subplot of a sort, or it can be the mystery can be who is the villain, what is he up to. That's kind of what I'm playing around with in the story that I'm currently working on.
Yeah, you just answered the question for us there, very deeply, because I think that firmly entrenches mystery into the plot as opposed to genre. Here's why I think that. So, if you have a mystery plot structure, what that means is if the mystery were to be solved, the plot um, becomes, or at least, or if it's a subplot, that subplot or the main plot becomes resolved, right? So there's definitely a structure where once that the central question is answered, that is like the main conflict is answering that question. The story is basically on its falling action at that point. That makes mystery very much very tightly um, or central or essential. That's the word I should use. It makes mystery essential to particular plot structures to make them what they are, and I think that ties it much more closely than we could ever really say about it in terms of genre. If we're saying that, well, if genre is function, every story makes the reader into a detective somewhat because there are always mysteries, but certain plots are the mystery, right? That it's like it
Hmm.
is the thing. So maybe mystery is now taken away. So horror seems to be a fundamental it has a telos, a function. This is a Here's a genre that I see that I really don't want to to survive this test, because I hate it because of how vague it is, but it might be legitimate, which really upsets me. And that's how you know you're on the truth, by the way. If like you start to think a thing and you suspect it's true, and it gives you that terrible feeling in your chest where you're like, "Oh no, this sucks." It's probably right. So you've probably heard the genre thriller, yes?
Yes, and off the top of my head, I'm thinking that's meant to. Actually, no. I'm thinking off the top of my head, that sounds analogous to horror, where it's meant to instill a certain feeling in the reader, but then say that that's a really vague concept as to what is a thrill. Any kind of story could give you any number of thrills, any different ways.
Yeah, it's really broad, it's really vague. I think the word is a bad word to use, but I think specifically in literature, it means that it's like exciting. And I
Hmm.
think that my worry here that I think is true is that I think thriller eats up what we normally think of as action adventure. Because when I think of action adventure, I think of the plot, but that doesn't say what it does to the reader. And so therefore as a genre, just in the way that mystery was very close to the plot, like you have some plots that require action or require adventure for them to be what they are, and the moment that those things stop, the plot stops. But thriller, to give someone a thrill, right, to make them excited, seems to me to fulfill genre as telos or genre as function of the novel. Um, what do you think of that analysis? I hope I'm wrong, by the way.
Um, Again, like thrill is such a broad uh, concept. Guess I'll admit I'm not extensively familiar with thriller as a genre, and my thought is that gets into objectivity. A lot of the same problems we have with genre can also be applied to a lot of the same problems we have with genre in the first place. It's like, well, what is thrilling to any given person? What do we expect to be thrilling? What does the author think is going to be thrilling to any given reader?
There is some subjectivity. I think the same thing could be true of horror, though. Like a lot of people, particularly
Yeah,
modern day
exactly.
people, might not think, let's say, Lovecraft is scary. Um, but I do think we can draw a line and say, okay, like imagine that we don't have our modern genre distinctions. And so I think a lot of science fiction, I think a lot of fantasy, the type of emotion that they primarily are made to instill in the readers might be some type of general excitement, like you would imagine you get if you are, uh, let's say, playing a sports game, or if you're I don't know, out cycling, or I don't know. Some people might not think this is exciting or fun, but if I go on a really long run out somewhere where I've never been before, there's a bit of like novelty and excitement about exploring a new place. Um, the I think the idea of like the thriller very well, or like I don't know if I'm about to go into a boxing match. That's probably a better example. We could say that type of adrenal related fight, right? The fight response or the move forward response in terms of excitement, we could attribute to thrills, and then we could say the flight response might be might be belong to horror. So because you can trigger either or.
Hmm.
And again, that ties it back to biology, like the archetypes, which which appeals to me naturally anytime I get hit on some type of objective essence. Um, ooh, okay, wait a minute. Let me think here. This might not be. Oh no! I discovered another terrible thing. So on my list here, I have romance as a genre.
Oh yeah.
Um, but I actually now but below romance. Do you know what I have on my list below romance? Can you guess?
Um, I'm not recognizing a pattern necessarily.
I have erotica because the people separate
Oh,
them.
okay, okay.
Yeah, right. Okay, so here's something I would hate to admit too. Romance, it's the same problem we just ran into with like mystery versus horror versus thriller versus action adventure. Some of those were plot related and some seem to be categorizable based on the what it functions for the reader. Well, romance is definitely plot, right? Because like that's like the you could even argue like romance is the hero's journey plot for women, basically. Um, and
Yes,
so
I've heard
okay,
Jordan Peterson's take on women's romance novels.
yeah, he is correct. But but if romance belongs to plot, and then I think of erotica, unfortunately, I think erotica might be the legitimate genre if we're going on teleology, because just like if thriller is like your fight response, your in terms of adrenal response, and horror is your flight response, then what we have is like erotica is like the sexual arousal response that would be tied back to the function of the work. Tell me how I'm wrong. I would like to be wrong. I don't want to give erotica any any legitimacy.
Uh,
Kill it, Brad. Come on.
I'd have to think. I'm not very good at thinking on my feet. I'd have to dwell on that for a minute.
All right. Well, you out there, audience, in the comments, if this goes up on YouTube and elsewhere, like please destroy the idea of genre being telos and erotica being legitimized. But yeah, okay. Well, that was an unexpected turn.
Shallow and
So
lacking artistic merit, and often just the author getting their rocks off and the reader getting their rocks off and all that. The best I got
yeah,
off the top of my head.
yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. So we've got so far we've kind of honed in. So what do you think of the idea so far as a whole, given because I've got other genre, quote unquote genres on the list. Um, but in terms of attributing certain things considered genre to, let's say, setting or to plot structure, and certain to the teleology of the work, what do you think of the, let's say, more Aristotelian method of categorization that genre is telos or genre is function? Do you think that that stands up?
Some broader sense, maybe. Again, if we're going to define genre by the purpose or by its by its function, by what sort of feeling it's meant to induce in the reader, because using thrill as an example, like I said, that could be again there's any number of ways to thrill the reader. You know, as long as you mention erotica, you could classify erotica as a type of thriller.
You could, but let's say if I wanted to make these terms useful, because my immediate thought is, okay, well, what the hell is the point of this anyway, right? Like, why do we even have this word? And I think the word is so that we could communicate what it is that we actually mean to communicate. Now, I don't like the way that these sound because again, like I hate thriller because, like you said, this the word itself is a bad choice of word. It people it's got too many connotations. But let's say that it means like
Hmm.
the fight part of the flight or fight response, and then I say something like, okay, I've written a let's say action adventure fantasy thriller. Does that have a function? Because what I've done there is I took one of the elements that is of setting, I took one that we attributed to the plot, and I attributed one to the effect that it's meant to have on the reader to see if that actually each instead of it being redundant it being specific, like here's a fantastical story where in which the fantastical elements are going to be somewhat magical in orientation as opposed to more science based. It's action and adventure, which means that the plot revolves on the some conflict that's going to amount to like a fight or exploring somewhere, and it's meant to make you feel that feeling of excitement that you would get into by being in a fight or going out and exploring a new place. That hold water?
Um, that's a lot to take in.
Well, we can think of it this way. Let me try and change up some of the variables one at a time, right? Because I think if I do that, that'll tell us if this is legitimate. So instead of using thriller at the end,
Because I mean,
I'll stick with fantasy action adventure, and I suddenly say it's a fantasy
mhm.
action adventure horror as opposed to an fantasy action adventure thriller. Does that make you, if I say, okay, well, it's fantastical, magical, we're going to go, these characters are going to go on some type of adventure, and it's going to be terrifying. Do you think that that has enough distinctiveness to it?
Not sure, honestly.
Okay, let's try our third category here to see if that works out. So, through because horror, like flight and fight, those are pretty close. But if I suddenly said it's a fantasy action adventure erotica, does that specify what I might be talking about? If someone told you that as the genre.
I guess, but then those elements often aren't going. Those elements won't necessarily mix well.
They very well may not, right? Like maybe unless you're just into weird, like I don't know, what's the word? Promiscuous, like mages traveling from town to town visiting each brothel. I'm sure someone has written that story. Uh,
The 34.
so so perhaps it doesn't hold as much water as I'm trying to make this bucket work with. But I do I don't know, I do have a liking for the idea that we tie genre to its purpose toward the reader because I could have an adventure story that has a multitude of let's say purposes it's meant to do. Like we had thriller, horror, erotica, and I could think of something like I don't have a single word for it, but something that's like educational as being a function, like a story that's made to educate you. You could say like, okay, well, what do we have historical fiction that is, I guess we'd call it educational historical fiction, something like that. Um, because that's like a possible function. Can you think of any others? Anything else that you might want? Anything else you might want to trigger specifically, a feeling or an effect that you might want to impose upon the reader?
Any other feelings or effects? So we've already covered fear with horror. We've covered fight or flight with thriller. One that comes to my mind would be wonder, which any kind of many different types of stories can induce in the reader. You know, whether it's a fantastical realm or a uh, expansive sci-fi galaxy.
That is a good one. That feeling of awe, right?
Hmm.
I'm not even sure. I can't even think of because wonder is a good word, but it would be weird to describe thing like you wouldn't describe the book as a wonder. It would be like awe-inspiring, but that's too clunky.
Hmm.
I have to think about that one. What we would exactly call that?
What would you call a genre that's meant to invoke a sense of wonder in the reader?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. But that one might take a while to single out a particular word for that.
Hmm.
All right. Well, we're closing in on our hour. Let's go over a couple details, see if we can come to some conclusions about this. So, um, we were in agreement that genre is a form of category. We settled that. We talked about the conventional way of thinking of genre, which had to do with tropes, conventions of use at a time and place, expectations, and then desires. Are we pretty conclusive about the, let's say, not very firm foundations of basing genre on trope and convention and expectation? Are we in agreement that that's probably not a good place to define genre, or do you think that that still has some merit?
Mm, I think a lot of people a lot of people see a certain amount of usefulness, usefulness in it. But again, that's dependent on the time and place, and it's not necessarily all that universally useful.
Yeah, so it can get by as we get by now, but we
Yeah,
do run into the problem of the necessity of infinite, or not necessarily, but many subcategories in order for us to communicate.
that's fair to say as well. Like I said, with the example of how many different types of subgenres and then subgenres of subgenres.
Yeah. Um, and then we finally arrived at perhaps Aristotle being right that perhaps genre should only refer to um, the function of the work, what it's primarily meant to do to the reader, leaving off the other elements for things like setting or plot or even potentially character and theme. We didn't even talk about those. Um, so gun to the head, what's your final analysis on that? Because I think that's, if I had to give mine, I would say that my thinking from this conversation, I hadn't thought this through before, but I feel pretty, not firm, but I want to explore more in the future this idea of genre as telos, genre as function of the work, because I feel uh, it gives itself a useful point of categorization that can be combined with the others to make a distinct description of a particular story. That's my take on it. What's your take on the idea as genre as function or genre as telos?
Well, if we're defining it as a certain if you're defining that as the feeling it's supposed to induce in the reader, again, that becomes subjective because what one reader finds, scary or thrilling or arousing or any of that, and another reader won't necessarily. They might just be bored by it. They might think it's poorly executed or something like that. So, if you're going to say the feeling it's meant to induce in the reader, then that brings in author intentions, which also can get kind of messy because there can be an element that ends up being woven into the story that the author did not intend to be there, or people could be just misreading it en masse.
That is definitely an issue. My mind immediately went to the four categories of what makes a thing what it is, and that just runs right up into what's commonly referred to as the death of the author. The question that that bears out of that is, are there human universals when it comes to, um, let's say, some of the stimuli that cause us to experience certain things? Like, are there human universals, or what we could say are universal enough amongst most normally functional human beings that instill fear, that instill a feeling of wonder or awe, or that instill a feeling of excitement. Uh, that I don't know if we're going to be able to answer that here, um, but that's
Yeah,
certainly.
that would be the best shot at it that I guess you would have is universal enough, applicable enough.
Yeah, I think that that's, if genre as telos has any feet, it has to find that. It would have to find, okay, what is it that makes almost all human beings afraid in like the third order abstract, right? Like, and if I was Lovecraft, I would get up close to the microphone. I would say fear of the unknown, or something like that. Um,
It was on my
right?
mind as well.
Yeah. So yeah, that I guess that does warrant some more discussion. So I guess the last question to be answered here is, um, should genre, in the way that we talk about it, should we keep using it, or should we start to cast it aside and find different ways of categorizing our fiction? What do you think?
That's a good question. I, mm, it would have to be that'd have to be a really big discussion amongst a lot of people, because right now people find genre a useful enough convention. They use it, even if, as we've shown in the last hour, there are a lot of problems with how we conceptualize it and how it kind of falls apart when you try to get into the nitty gritty details. It's it's worth having the discussion. I don't know that I wouldn't firmly say genre as a concept could be disposed of, but I'm interested in the furtherance of that discussion, because if we're going to dispose of genre as a concept, or redefine genre anyway, there's got to be somewhere we can get to that we can give it a solid redefinition, a more useful, more applicable definition.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good place to throw that question out to the audience. What do you guys think? Like, what can genre be saved? If it can be, how ought it be transformed to be more useful? Let us know. And Brad, before we go, do you want to throw out any of your social media handles or anything like that? Anything you want to advertise yourself with?
Yeah, I guess I can mention my Minds page. It's minds.com/codename Wraith. I post. I haven't in a while, but I post a number of short stories there for your reading pleasure. I don't have any books out right now, and probably will be sometime before I do. So nothing to promote on that front. But yeah, that's
All
that's
right.
really all I have right now.
Well, for all you out there listening, make sure if you're on minds.com that you subscribe to Brad and check out his short stories that he has, and be on the lookout in the future. Breathe down his neck, make sure he feels the pressure that he has an audience awaiting that want him to produce many a novel that'll be hunting you down like your George R. R.
Sure,
Martin, who some
sure.
people don't like. And I'll show myself very shortly again. Remember, I offer my editing service. So it's a Wild Isle style guide at wildislelit.com/editing. Go check out my page there. I've got my novel out, One Smoke Broken, and I've got a series of short stories that'll be coming out within the next few months. I'll start advertising and talking and marketing about that all in the future. And I think that's all for shilling. Oh, last thing, if you want to participate on this podcast, if you are an author and you know me or know about me, or we have some point of contact where I can trust just randomly reaching out to you on the internet, um, please do contact me. And if you've got an idea for a topic of discussion that we haven't already listed, go ahead and pitch it. All right, Brad. Well, this has been a really great conversation. It went as well as I could hope to have gone, and I like that we came somewhere where I didn't think we were going to go, validating erotica as perhaps being one of the fundamental aspects of genre. Oh no, uh,
What have we done?
unleash the horror onto the internet. All right, Brad. Uh, I'll uh, I'll talk to you next time.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.